Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Hail to
That's
Pitt,
awesome.
right?
Yeah, hail to Pitt.
My daughter just finished her freshman year at Pitt.
Oh, fantastic.
She's very excited.
It's going to be a strange sophomore year, I'll tell you that.
It's going to be a very strange sophomore year, especially with taking organic.
Ooh, who does she have?
Elizabeth, who's your organic chemistry professor? Paul.
Oh, I love Paul.
Well, he's been sending out some like emails about the course and getting started, and she's been reading them to me, and they're hilarious.
Paul is amazing. She's going to have a fantastic sophomore year.
So
And I had Michael Goldie last semester.
yeah, she had Michael Goldie in the spring. I loved his lectures. I made her play them out loud. Like I'm sitting at, she's sitting at the dining room table, and I made her. I'm like, we can't miss Dr. Goldie's lessons. I've got to hear Dr. Goldie. I teach AP Chem, so I want to hear what Dr.
Sure.
Goldie's doing.
It's funny. I've noticed the students have a strange dichotomy about their opinions of Goldie.
Right.
They're either very, very positive or very, very negative.
Oh, well, it's very high level what he was doing. This was not.
He's a really smart guy. And it's fantastic. Just watching him teach is always funny because in person, he always wears a latex glove so he doesn't get chalk on his hand.
Oh, that's so funny.
And it's little idiosyncrasies like that drive people nuts about him. Like, this guy just wants clean hands. I mean, I respect that.
Right. But in terms of like the content and the approach to the classes and all the support and the extra practices, we really, I enjoyed that tremendously. I was hoping I could get him to present this summer, but he did not respond to my email.
Oh, that's a shame.
It's okay.
Well, I'm glad you had posted on Facebook, because I honestly didn't know about this conference. And I thought to myself, I've been sending out basically this whole presentation to the Pitt faculty saying, here's what I did.
Right. Right.
And,
well, there are a lot of people here who want to hear about this. Assessment's been an ongoing issue. I know it's one of my big things.
I can tell you, everything I'm presenting today is tried and true from the summer semester.
That's awesome. This is what people want to hear. There are some other college faculty members here at the conference. And I don't know who's, we don't know in advance who's coming into what session, but they're all going to be recorded. So even if they can't, actually, I'm going to pause the recording. All right. Hi, and welcome to this session, a multifaceted approach to combat integrity issues in student assessment. And our presenter today is Dr. Matthew Tracey, who is an assistant professor of chemistry at the University of Pittsburgh Johnstown. He received his Bachelor in Science degree from Fordham University, graduating in 2011. He then received his PhD in chemistry from the University of Pittsburgh in 2017, following which he joined the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh Johnstown as a visiting assistant professor. He later accepted a position as an assistant professor of chemistry. He is currently engaged in research of biologically active compounds for the treatment of filoviruses, as well as new pedagogical methods. And we will go until 12:15 with this session today. So Matthew, when you're ready, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for having me. I feel like to start this off here so we can all get to know each other a little bit, I'm going to launch a quick poll. So if you would please check what Harry Potter house you belong in. Got a lot of people in Gryffindor, Ravenclaw. A lot of Gryffindors. A couple people haven't read Harry Potter. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, I can't vote.
All right, so we got an overwhelming majority of Gryffindor. Having taken a few of those sorting hat tests myself, I am also in Gryffindor, so it's good to see I'm in good company here. As pointed out, my talk today is about a new approach to combat integrity issues with student assessments. Everything I'm presenting here was tested in the summer 2020 six-week semester at the University of Pittsburgh. So all the data contained herein is sort of based on that. As we were all collectively thrown into the deep end in the spring, we all quickly pivoted to try to find a new way to give exams. And this is kind of what I came up with, so I'd like to share that with you. There we go. So let's talk first about student assessments. So sort of why do we give them? There's a lot of reasons. I mean, we can all go through and say, we want to make sure students are understanding the material. That's always a big one. Giving students feedback on their progress. I'm a big fan of, contacting students as much as possible to say, if you know what you're doing and you can keep up with things, you should be able to know that and validate that. And also from our end as instructors, evaluating the effectiveness of our teaching and determining if the course objectives are being met. If we don't know if we're hitting our goals as instructors, it's really hard to say. And so one thing we may do in a typical chemistry course is to give regular quizzes, homework, in-class work. I know POGL's becoming increasingly popular with that, with group assignments, and also exams. And all of this really got thrown into just complete chaos when it came to the spring. So one way to build student assessments is to focus a lot on learning objectives. I personally ascribe to a lot of Bloom's taxonomy to create a scaffold for how students learn. And typically you'll see this presented as sort of a pyramid. I'm presenting sort of the numbered list here that the first level, the base level of learning is remembering. Can a student memorize and recall data? I often refer to this to my students as sort of a brain dump. You get to an exam, you just write down everything you know, and you just repeat it back. And that's sort of the baseline level of their learning. Can they parrot it back to me? We also have understanding where you start to build a little more. They have to be able to clarify, explain, discuss. This is sort of that next level we start to see in short answer questions. When they have to interpret and solve data, falls under the applying level. So we start to build this up that to be able to apply, you have to understand. To understand, you have to remember. It sort of builds as a nice scaffold. We have analyzing where they distinguish and examine different results or different information given and have to really dig deep. This is pretty common a lot you see in lab courses where students go in and are given data and have to really understand it and analyze the data. But these last 2 points, evaluating, such as defending, judging, or appraising, and creating, really fall by the wayside in a lot of educational models I've noticed. So my goal with these new assessment paradigms is to not only keep this same paradigm, but also find a way to hit points 5 and 6, hit the highest points of that taxonomy to say, this is showing the students are really learning the material. And so in a normal semester, I would be going in a face-to-face environment, giving homework at the start of each chapter, at the end of the chapter, collect the homework, weekly quizzes given during the class, typically on Fridays. My first semester teaching, the students said that the quizzes always seemed like a pop quiz because I never confirmed them in advance. I said, have you noticed they're every Friday? It's not so much a surprise if the schedule doesn't change, but just short quizzes sort of check up on how they learned for the week. And then the big one that everybody always has in every chemistry class is those big 3 exams. The first midterm, the second midterm, the third one, and then the final. Those are going to be the whole class period. And they're usually going to be made up of a lot of multiple choice sections and short answer sections, making sure the students not only go through and can they remember data and pick a few points out, but also explain their answers. In a remote environment, this all gets completely flipped. No longer can we give them take-home homework and have the students say, okay, do these problems, hand them in at the end of the week. That goes out the window. We have to focus more on online homework. In my case, I've been adapting a lot of the learning systems such as SmartWork 5 through Norton, using Sapling and things like that to really give them homework and say, you can work on this at home, but I gave them a much longer window in which to work on it. Rather than have the homework be due at the start of the next chapter, to really work in this remote environment, because I personally can't go student by student and validate all of their major concerns and time constraints. A lot of students may be working. I push all the homework for each chapter, each section, to be due at the next exam. Chapters 1 through 4 to due on the date of exam number 1. And that gives them a bigger window they can work on it and practice on things. For quizzes, I can't dedicate 10 to 15 minutes of class time anymore because if the class is asynchronous, there's no way to really do that in class time. So I'd post them on a Wednesday through our learning management system, collect them on Friday, and those are going to be more just multiple choice and matching, things that are easily graded automatically. They can get their feedback as soon as they're done. They don't have to worry about writing out short answers. And so in some ways that does sacrifice a little bit of the learning they would have gotten in a face-to-face environment. But the big elephant in the room is exams. Quizzes can be done online with multiple choice and through an LMS. Homework, there's 100 services out there. You can pick the one you like. Exams become the big issue. How can we give an exam online? So a few challenges we have to remote exams. The first big one is student availability. how can we ensure all students can take an exam in a given time? As I'm sure we've seen in this adaptation to a remote environment, students aren't necessarily available during class time. They might be forced to work. They might not be able to get off a shift. They may have picked up a second job. So we have to find a way to make sure all the students can take a synchronous exam, which poses its own issues. We have to maintain the rigor of the exam. We want to make sure that we're not just passing out A's. I mean, I'm sure all of us would agree if we could just give every student an A, life would be easy. But then at the end of the day, it passes the buck to the next instructor. We want to make sure our exams are difficult enough to assess their learning and really challenge them, but also that opens up the issue for academic integrity. And based on those citations across the bottom, this isn't a new thing, that the temptation and accessibility of unauthorized resources is always going to be there. In a face-to-face environment, I can say when I was in high school, we all had to wear ties. I could tell you at least 10 students who would hide a little crib sheet in their tie. In a remote environment, we can't see the students. We can't see necessarily their surroundings. They could go on, we could respond to lockdown browsers, things like those are a little invasive for my tastes. Students are stuck with this overwhelming temptation, just open their phone and go on Chegg or something. So how do we minimize the temptation for that? Now, based on a very recent publication in the Journal of Chemical Education, there's a lot of things people have tried. Switching from fewer high-stake assessments to frequent low-stakes assessments. Instead of giving 3 large exams, give 10 exams. Switching to completely multiple choice exams, that has its own pros and cons. Mainly, we're sacrificing a lot of the rigor for the sake of the students that are then just bubbling in an answer sheet at home. We can focus on doing only higher order short answer questions, which causes the students to really engage in the learning, but that creates a bit of a backlog of sorts that you need to make enough exams that have enough varied short answer questions that the students can't cheat off one another by, if I could pick up my phone right now, you couldn't see that I'm doing anything with it. If I have a friend also taking the exam, can't see that I'm able to text them saying, hey, what'd you put down for number 5? Take-home exams have also been sort of floated as an idea to this, but that opens up the big issue that you're putting the students on the honor system to say, I'm not going to be doing this thing. I'm not going to go on Chegg. I'm not going to Google the answers. I've tried supplementing my exams with take-home portions, and within a day, the exam is on Chegg. And the students are getting answers. They Google them. They say, I looked it up online and I found this. I said, you weren't supposed to look it up online, which also leads to integrity pledges. I have them on every exam I give. I tell the students, if you don't sign it, I'll understand that you either use an unauthorized material or maybe you forgot. I tell them, if you forgot, you can sign it on the way out. But putting that may help to stop some students from wanting to cheat. It may give the ones who decide to cheat an out to say, I cheated on the exam, I'm acknowledging it. But at the end of the day, all of this is still working on the honor system. So my approach that I did for the summer was a new paradigm, which I call break it up. We always write in-person exams with multiple parts, be them multiple choice, short answer, etc. So rather than making that one big 60-minute assessment, I focused on saying, why not make it separate assessments? Why not have part 1 be its own assessment worth 60 points, part 2 as a multiple choice section worth 30 points, part 3 is a take-home portion worth 10 points for a total score of 100. And I'm going to go through this piece by piece to show how this system works, because I'm sure some of you are looking at this saying, that's just the standard breakdown for an exam. The students take 60% of the exam as short answer, 30% multiple choice, 10% take home. But I took this idea and sort of adapted it to a remote environment. So rather than having the students take this all in one sitting, I've had students take the exam over the course of 3 days. The short answer part is the only synchronous portion of the exam. In the summer, I sent out a Google Doc poll and said, in which windows are you able to take the exam? I gave them 3 blocks, 9 to 10, 12 to 1, 5 to 6. Said, if you can't sign up for these times, please let me know. Students would sign up for a time. I would open up I'd open up a Zoom meeting. They'd log in. I'd send them the exam, and it was only 5 or 6 short answer questions. Really quick to grade, just answers that adapted things from the remembering, understanding, applying, and analyzing tiers of this learning scaffolding. And that was all they got. It was 1 hour, took about 10 minutes per question, And one way this ensured the academic integrity was the exam was proctored. Much like the meeting today, it was recorded. I told the students that upon the completion of the exam, I would take the recording and review it for any instances of academic dishonesty. If I saw anybody looking around or using their phone or anything, I had them set their camera angle so I could see them writing the whole time. As if anything seemed fishy, I would look into it. If nothing seemed fishy by the time I returned the exam, the recording was deleted. So it's a show of good faith on my part. Please don't, show me that I've misplaced that trust. And for the students uploading their answers, to keep it completely paperless, because I wasn't physically in the lecture hall, they uploaded their answers to Canvas, initially using the Cam Scanner app, which I've recently learned in the last 48 hours is apparently very bad malware. So please, if you're using some of this, use Tiny Scanner, or as we were saying before this started, anybody who has iPhones, you can scan as PDFs. Just taking a free app, snap a picture of their exam, upload it to Canvas. I then took those, ran them through Gradescope, built a quick rubric, checked off if they got things right, made notes. They got their short answer back, usually within 48 to 72 hours. Genius Scan is also, thank you in the chat there. We have a Genius Scan is also another good app. If you have any other ideas for good scanning apps, please drop them in the chat. I'm still trying to get my syllabi together for the fall, so I'm trying to find any way to get these students to scan without inadvertently exposing all their banking information. So a few examples of how I used this part 1 short answer. Here's an example question from one of the exams. And I will say all of the questions that I'm going to present are filtered through the lens of being an organic chemist.
Matt, if I could pause you for a moment, a question
sure.
came up in the chat about what is Gradescope?
Oh, Gradescope is an online service that allows you to create a grading rubric online. For instance, if I was looking at a question like this, it breaks down, says, just to go through the question first, one of the reactions proceeds at a much faster rate than the other, identify the major reaction pathway, which reaction is faster, and provide a brief explanation as to why one is faster, using at least 1 to 2 sentences and 1 structure. So with Gradescope, if the question were uploaded there, I could create a rubric that would say, they identified the major pathway correctly, plus 2 points. They identified the reaction is faster, plus 1 point. Explanation, I could say, plus the remaining 3 points, plus 2 if they didn't have a structure instead of 2 out of 3. It's a way to very quickly and rapidly grade scanned online assignments. Depending on the institution you're at, you may be able to get a site license for it. I know the University of Pittsburgh has a site license that allows us to have free accounts. There's also SpeedGrader, which is integrated into Canvas. That one I had a little bit of hit or miss results with, hence the switch to Gradescope. But it allows you to create very easy to use rubrics by just checking boxes. And one thing with these short answer questions you may notice, they're not just one quick thing. It breaks it down by saying, do you know which one is faster? Sure, they have a 50-50% chance of guessing that, which could fall under just remembering one of these is going to be faster because Dr. Tracey said so. But they have to also understand the pathway it goes through, which then builds into why is it faster? It builds all of these different levels into one single question that the students realistically have 10 to 15 minutes to answer this. Those of us out there who are big organic chemistry buffs, I'm sure you look at this going, of course, it's the top one. It's an E1 reaction, and it goes to a tertiary carbocation. But building the questions for the short answer section to cover multiple parts really helps the students to then not have to panic as much. Additionally, another question I gave them, this is also from one of the exams, using butane as your only carbon source, propose a synthesis of 3,4-dimethylhexane-3-ol. You may use any other reagents you like, but all carbons in your final molecule must come from butane. Your synthesis should show all intermediate molecules, but does not need a mechanism. Another example here where the students have to apply multiple levels of their tiered learning. Most of us in organic chemistry always give at least one mechanism question in an exam. This is going to be their big synthesis question where they don't need a mechanism. They have to draw from all of their knowledge they know of how to convert a 4-carbon chain to this seemingly much more complex molecule. So by creating the short answer questions, I tried to find a way to give them something they could easily earn partial credit for, but also adapt multiple layers of the learning. And that's just for the part 1. This is the stuff they would have an hour to complete of about 5 questions about this difficulty. totaling up for the 60 points. To move on to part 2, this is where we start to get asynchronous with learning. This is where the break it up model really starts to shine, in my opinion. Instead of having them do their multiple choice during the same period as the short answer, I offered it asynchronously through Canvas. It was timed at 30 minutes, so any of the students who wanted to take it would have 30 minutes to take this part of the exam. They would have 48 hours from when the exam started to finish it. So if I gave an exam on a Wednesday, they'd have through Friday to get this done. And it was only 10 to 15 short questions, mostly multiple choice and matching, just like the quizzes before. But this time, I really zeroed them in on that portion, on the levels of like the remembering, applying, and analyzing. I tried to get laser focused on that because I knew part 3 was going to cover the other bases. Now, to ensure the academic integrity in this, the exam is timed. Any of us who found an exam posted to Chegg will see it probably comes up in about 20 minutes of giving the exam, and they get an answer within half an hour. By timing the exam, it minimizes the window the students that try to cheat could. Unfortunately, it does create sort of a system where the honest students are also freaking out because of the time, but it's to minimize the issue that they can try to post the exam and get answers back. One thing that's also possible, depending on the LMS you're using, students can be presented one question at a time. By clicking through, they'll see one question, they answer to then see the next question. In some cases, a lot of professors proposed removing backtracking from this, that they have to answer that question, lock in their answer before moving to the next section. In my experience, doing that really negatively affects the honest students. Because how many of us here have ever taken an exam, answered a question, and then gone back to change an answer? I would muster a guess that probably all of us have been like that. So by just presenting one question at a time, it minimizes the risk of a student posting the entire exam in one shot, but also gives the honest students, the ones who aren't really the ones we're worried about here, the chance to go back and change their answers if they need to. And one thing that took a little bit of time with this was writing a question pool. I would take the same question and write it 4 different ways and just shuffle the answers. So every student had a 1 in 4 chance of getting the same question as another student, but they had no idea. So by creating a question pool saying, here's 5 possibilities, assign 2 of these, here's 3 possibilities for number 2, assign 1 of these, it does create a big bank that the students, if they try to look something up on something like Chegg or Google, anything like that, it does create a bit of a system where they can't necessarily know they're getting the right answer. It minimizes the possibility that a student can use these options, but also by timing it and presenting one question at a time, it minimizes the temptation to even try. So a couple examples of how I did multiple choice examples here. One of them, you can kind of see in this first question, how it shuffled the answers around a bit. Which of the following reaction conditions will produce the opposite stereochemistry of an alcohol? First option being none of these invert the stereochemistry. Then we have a couple reaction conditions. These all produce a racemic mixture, as well as 2 more conditions. When I wrote this, A and D were actually the bottom 2. It negates the use of the all of the above or none of the above. It does require just a little changing of the wording there. But at the end of the day, 2 students would see possibly the exact same question with completely shuffled answers there. It also shows how the student has to understand what's happening. They can check multiple boxes. Again, those of us who focus in organic chemistry, I look at this and say, oh, at least a couple of these will invert the stereochemistry. And also one way to change that, which produces the same stereochemistry. Which of these removes the stereochemistry? 3 questions there come up from changing 1 word. We also have the second question there, a Grignard reagent can act as a, you have 4 possibilities, and the students would be presented the option that each of these questions would be anywhere from about 4 to 6 points of the total by saying, okay, if you mark the correct answer, you get a point. If you don't mark one of the incorrect answers, you get a point. And if you did mark something that wasn't right, or you didn't mark something that was right, you don't get a point. It is sort of a positive scaffolding scale rather than subtracting points. By doing that, the students really they responded well with the multiple choice section to say, this is really just checking the boxes. You go through, check them as you go, and there you go. But not all of the part 2 sections were just very quick and easy remembering. This is one of my favorite questions because one of the students emailed me as soon as they finished their exam and said, Dr. Tracey, where did you find that question? A chiral compound with the chemical formula C5H8 reacts under the catalytic hydrogenation conditions to produce an achiral compound with the chemical C5H10. What is the identity of the starting material? Whereas there's types that identify, there should be identity. None of the students caught that, surprisingly. But with this, they have 4 possibilities. They can just draw 4 structures and see if any of them could be a chiral compound. They then say, okay, does it have the right chemical formula? Will it give me an achiral compound upon reacting? The students are really digging deep to not only just say, it's definitely one of these 4 or none of them, but they have to really think above and beyond, does it fit all of the things in the checked boxes? And now the part that I'm sure a lot of you are the most curious about is the take-home portion. I previously in this presentation, take-home exams, I'm not the biggest fan because students always find a way to cheat on them. Doing a take-home portion, I instead sort of gave the students a peek behind the curtain. I focused on evaluating and creating their own questions. On the day of the exam, the students would be given access to their take-home prompt and would be given 72 hours to complete it. So much like they have 1 hour for part 1, 2 days for part 2, 3 days for part 3, it gives them the option to work on the exam instead of just all brain dumping it in one sitting. And the task they were typically given was to write an exam question based on a provided rubric restriction and explain how that question would be graded. So not only do they have to write a question that's good enough for an exam, but they have to see how they would grade that question. And I offered the students a bonus point for giving a wrong answer and explaining why it's wrong. Sort of giving them the idea of, like, when you write a rubric, how would you, as a student, want this question graded? How would you go forth and make this happen? And with this, the rubrics were always posted that they got very unique answers. And I have an example on the next slide here where they were told to design a synthesis with only 5 simple things to break it down. Your starting material all has to be alkanes. It has to involve the formation of an alkene. It has to involve the regioselective conversion of an alkene to something else. You have to have a carbon-carbon bond formation, and all intermediate molecules have to be produced and shown. That's all it was. And you'd be surprised at how clever the students got with this. I got students who wanted to take a straight chain and make a ring out of it. I had one student who wanted to make benzene, which created its own issues in the converting an alkene to something else. But it demonstrates to them they can make their own question. And in doing this, as I said, it gives you a peek behind the curtain. Because whenever we write an exam and give it to the students, I can almost guarantee at least one student walks out of all of our classes and says, wow, how did they come up with that exam? How do we know that was covered in class? I've had many students come up to me after an exam and say, we didn't cover that in class. And said, we did. That was last Wednesday. But with this, the students really get a piece of their own education. And one thing it does here, the students really, in essence, if they follow these simple rubrics, get a free 10 points. I tell my students, if you follow the rubric and you do it right, this should be a free 10 points. By breaking this up, there's no single part of the exam that can completely tank their grade. And with this, they're getting a free 10 points. One of the questions just popped in, do I find the students share all their questions with learner? I saw very little correlation between any of the questions students wrote. And I told them that they can use their textbooks, they can use their notes, they can do anything they want as long as it's an original question. No student had the same answer twice. I had one student who actually went above and beyond in Organic 1, pulling topics from way later in Organic 2. But I could tell they were all prefaced in the book by how they wrote it. They were going above and beyond. It gives them their own little free stake in their own learning. And this is why I was saying it really engages the evaluating and creating section of the Bloom's taxonomy model. No, they're not just remembering things or applying things. They have to create something from what they know. And one thing that I thought was important to point out here is sort of a pseudo assessment of my own methods here. Like, how did the exam scores look? Overall, the exam scores showed very, very little statistical difference. The summer 19 section is based on a 50-person class that was taught face-to-face of the exact same material. The summer 20 model was the remote option, which had 68 students. I did notice a major explosion of students enrolling when they found out it was online. We noticed the exam scores, even for the statistically minded here, aren't much different. The error bars there show the standard deviations that the averages themselves were slightly higher, albeit with a little bit of a bigger swing on the standard deviation, but they were as expected. There was no major change in student performances. The big thing that I worried about was the student opinions on this, because all of us know that students are really the bottom line in how we look as instructors. People can look at test scores and say, oh, person A gave a much harder test than person B. Person B always gives out A's. And I was curious of, did this model really work to help them work better in a remote atmosphere? So I asked them, does the new format relieve stress? Do they prefer the format to a traditional exam? And did they find it easy to navigate? So this y-axis is just the percentage of respondents that I got from the summer course. An overwhelming, almost 70%, over 70% of the students agree that this new model relieved the stress of having to go in for a high-stakes 1-hour exam. There were a couple students that seemed to disagree or would leave very negative comments about it, but on the whole, the student opinions show that this was a lower stress format of an exam, and it gave them a better format to work. I mean, a lot of them seemed to prefer it to a traditional exam. And the students that said they preferred it to the traditional exam often emailed me and said, it really helps to not worry about going into one exam where everything is on the line. If a third of your grade is determined 1 hour of a class time at a time, it's going to create a lot of undue stress. Oh, do students answer their own questions? So for the assessment, the students do answer their own questions. They would have to write the question scaffold, take the rubric that I provided for the question itself, and then also answer their own. Which also, when they have to write their own incorrect answer, I notice it sort of helps them to click. You dangle a bonus point, and students will always do extra work. So if I give you an extra bonus point to say write an incorrect answer, they will find a way to say why it's wrong, inadvertently teaching themselves a bit more to say, this is what I wrote that was wrong. This is how it clicks through. And on part 3, the very big thing that mattered to me was that they felt it helped them learn the material and stimulated their thinking. Again, we have just the percentages on the y-axis there, but an overwhelming majority of students either agreed or strongly agreed that it helped them learn the material better and stimulated their thinking. By really giving them the keys to their own kingdom of saying, write a part of the exam, this is on you, it helps them to learn not only how we as instructors write exams, helps them to build their own grading rubric to say, I drew this arrow wrong, maybe it's worth 2 points off instead of 5, but also stimulates their thinking that they have to be creative. They have to dig deep into their own creative thought process and say, this is how I would come up with this question. This is how I would grade it. And I really think with the exam scores showing very little change, but also the overwhelmingly positive student opinions, this method is worth pursuing in the future. And just to really hammer home how much the students felt about this, I took a few student testimonials here. One of them said that it really helped because they weren't a good test taker. I'm sure we've all had at least 1 or 2 students who say, I really struggle on exams. I have difficulty sitting down for an hour and just writing down everything I know. It gives people away up to 40% of their exam that they don't have to be sitting there under the high stress of being watched the whole time. One student even said that they felt it was a better test of their knowledge than just entirely open response. With the multi-part format, I aim to engage those 6 points of Bloom's taxonomy rather than just saying, fill in the blank, fill out a multiple choice. It gives them a more rounded scaffold to how they learn things. And this last one was one of my personal favorites, that the students appreciated the multiple choice part because they could take a break and recover after the first part. I'm sure a lot of you always see the students walking out of an exam room and they just seem like they went 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. They always look exhausted and drained. I told my students, when you're done with your Zoomed proctored portion, go for a walk. Go have lunch. Go do something that isn't related to work. Because when I applied this, it was a 6-week course. 6 weeks versus 15 is a lot faster. But by giving them a break and saying, go for a walk or something, I actually even offered extra credit for the students to go outside once a week and post a selfie to Padlet. You go to Padlet.com. I'll put it in the chat here if anybody else is interested in trying this. So go to that website, post a selfie of you not doing work once a week. Because otherwise the students will be so zeroed in this remote atmosphere, they have to be working 24/7. They'll be burned out by Halloween. By giving them options of breaking up exams and just getting extra credit for going outside, the students really develop a lot less stress. Can I upload a sample exam? I will upload a sample exam. Yes, I'll do that as soon as this talk is over. And so just to wrap this up here, in summary, the student assessment, specifically exams, it does pose a very unique problem in remote classrooms. We have not only the accessibility, but also the ease of access and the temptation to just post an exam onto Chegg and get an answer back. I mean, you may be thinking, what about watermarking it? If anybody's gone on Chegg or even checked out the Strategies for Teaching Chemistry Online Facebook group, the students are getting very creative of just putting pieces of paper over a watermark or something. By breaking this up, it allows for both a synchronous and asynchronous assessment while keeping the academic rigor. The open-ended take-home portion kept a small stakes portion of the exam that 10%, it swings them a full letter grade if they do it, but they all want to do it because it gives them that insight. The student testimonials confirmed lower stress and a preference for the exam format. Over 70% of those who responded said they like this. So I always feel like that's the big thing there, is that with the students who, I want to give them a format they're going to prefer and not completely freak out. And the biggest barrier to implementation is really the time commitment. I kind of danced about this through the entire talk, but writing this portion of the exam for the multiple choice, yes, it's changing one or two words, but the biggest barrier is having to write multiple versions of the same exam and changing one or two little things. But overall, I think it's a worthwhile paradigm to sort of try out. And with that, I have time for any questions if anybody has any.
All right, so a question just came up in the chat. How did you decide on the percent weightings for the exam? And have you thought about other ways of doing that?
So I decided the percentages because I wanted the synchronous portion to be a large enough piece that the students were invested in it, but not enough that if they were to completely blank out that they would outright fail. Even with a bad test-taking student, they should be able to get some of the points in the short answer question. I kept the performance part at 10% because I felt like anything more, and I'm really tipping the scale into giving away 15, 20 free points for the exam itself. But at 10%, it's enough that the students want to do it because it's a full letter grade, but it's easy enough that it's not going to completely sway their test averages.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Another question came up in the chat. How to do the synchronous portion. A lot of times in the high school setting, we're not allowed to watch them on Zoom or, proctor a test via Zoom. Do you have any suggestions on how we might be able to get them all to take the test online at the same time?
There are the possibility of like Respondus browser lockdowns, different software like that, which carry their own pros and cons. I personally wasn't a big fan of those. I thought I would do the proctoring myself. But if you were to if you were to put the exam up or distribute it at the exact same time, say within a 5-minute lead, and then have the students, your answers have to be posted by a given window there, it does create a sort of urgency that if you're not watching them directly, you do sort of remove the possibility that they could go back and look things up. But if you say your exam will be available from 10 o'clock to 10:15 to be accessed, and your answers have to be up by 11 o'clock, it creates that window that they have to be working synchronously. I also noticed one of the questions in the chat there about with the extra credit and the internet not being reliable enough. I did actually experience some difficulties with that. Strangely enough, on my end, in the middle of one of my exams, the power went completely out in my apartment. And the students said, well, what do we do now? Like, we're not being watched anymore. And for the students who do have recurring internet problems, at least in my experience with Pitt, they are offering giving them mobile hotspots. If you look into the administration, your respective school administrations, they may be able to help with that. But in my experiences, that was a very, very, very small issue.
I think also you could find other ways for the students to submit extra credit. It wouldn't have to be the Padlet. It wouldn't have to be, something that they turned in to you. I'm sure there's other ways you could come up with, where they could just email you or draw a picture, or there's all kinds of options if you wanted to give them a free extra credit point for just doing something not chemistry test related.
I just found it funny with the extra credit, since you mentioned drawing a picture, something like that. I learned a lot more about my students by their postings on Padlet than I would have ever had just for them sitting in a lecture hall staring at me blankly. Like, one of my students runs an apiary out of his home.
That's cool.
For oral testing in small groups, I have not personally explored that. I've noticed with, especially with the organic chemistry courses, a lot of it depends on their arrow pushing and drawing mechanisms, things like that. I have worked with students to say, if we're on a Zoom call, can you verbally explain where the electrons are starting and where they're ending?
Yeah.
But I haven't really worried too much about doing oral assessments. That's not something I've explored.
Matt, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just so I understand kind of the setup and timing of how you do these online assessments.
Mm-hmm.
So the first part would be, let's say, during a class period.
Yes.
Where you would have to be hopefully on Zoom with them, where you can kind of monitor, even though they can be doing things off camera, but you're at least hopefully monitoring them.
As best we can.
And then the second part, the multiple choice,
Mm-hmm.
is that kind of assigned as a homework assignment where it's open at a certain time, closed at a certain time?
Yes. The multiple choice section would open the morning of the exam at 8 a.m. and it would close out 48 hours later.
And that's the same day as the synchronous short answer.
It starts the same day as the synchronous, it ends the next day. Or 2 days later, sorry.
And so though you're shuffling the questions and answers, if it's open for an extended period, do you find sharing of the questions, or do you do enough versions that it's not possible?
Because of the question pooling, it makes it very hard for the students to say they have the exact same question. But also because when they start that section there, it is in a 30-minute window. So it's available for 48 hours. They can only look at that section for 30 minutes.
Because I'm just thinking of my past students. I'm thinking they would screenshot, send all the various questions to the next group. Again, that might just be my group that I'm thinking of.
It's entirely possible that was the case. But one thing that, depending on how you're administering that section, with Canvas, it does measure how long a student is on each question.
Yeah.
So if I notice a student's taking 10 minutes on a question that should take maybe a minute, it does sort of raise a red flag that I can look into.
And then the take home, is that due the same day, or is that more of a long term?
That would be due 3 days after the start of the exam.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
This is Tomas. I'm just wondering, have you analyzed how a student did on the third part of the exam compared to the second and first, in terms of whether a lot of students who did much better on the third part than on the first two, and vice versa, or was it pretty consistent? Somebody did really well on part 1 and 2, they also did well on 3.
I noticed that the scores were fairly consistent across the board. I didn't do a deep dive into the grading for those, but I did notice that if a student tended, because when I put these on Canvas, I should explain this first. The gradebook had 3 separate columns for it. It had part 1 marked at 60 points, part 1 at 60 points, part 2 at 30 points, part 3 at 10 points. I did notice when I started to add them up that students who struggled on the short answer tended to make minor mistakes in part 3. The biggest issue became, for instance, using a Grignard reaction. A lot of students who got that wrong in the short answer didn't go back and realize they were doing it wrong in the take-home portion. So it does create sort of a small issue that, depending how quickly you can return part 1 to them, they may not know they're making a mistake there, even though they have access to their notes and my recorded lectures to do part 3. I noticed that for the most part, part 3 was, as I mentioned, pretty much a free 10 points. Most students got a minimum of 5 unless they did really, really, really bad. And that would be they completely missed the point. They didn't follow the baseline of the rubric. For a synthesis question, they didn't use the reactions they were supposed to. They missed out on a carbon-carbon bond formation or did one incorrectly. And even that would be still at least 5 out of 10.
And then my follow-up question is, I don't know how much your final exam was worth in terms of the whole semester. Did you find a lot of students who did much better on the exam than they have done previously in the course and vice versa?
For my final exam, I actually used the ACS standardized exam. And the students were pretty consistent with where they were from the first 3 exams to the final. Overall, I didn't use the ACS final for the summer, so I intentionally omitted that data. But the students compared to the national average from this actually did slightly above, which was encouraging.
Great, thanks.
Mhm.
Any other questions? This is just, it's just, my brain is starting to like really think about, ooh, how could I do this? And how could I do that? The take home questions, I think, I've done projects in the past where I had students write like a practice test instead of taking a test, but it was a big project. I like that it's sort of small and controlled. You're doing it, and you can include multiple parts, you know, multiple aspects in the question they have to write, and then write an answer key for. I really like that, but it's manageable. We're not talking about a big giant project. It's a small thing and quick to grade. My brain is moving again.
Just to comment on the speed of grading that part 3 section, in my class of 68 students, I could grade all of those in less than an hour.
That's cool.
Because you're not looking at every minute detail, because if a student did it correctly, all you gotta do is check they did it right, or you say you missed this one step. Because they're writing their own answer key for it, they're really doing the work for us.
Right. Right.
I think the low, thank you first of all, Matt, for your presentation. I think the lower value that you're assigning to it is really important, because what you mentioned, like in a very briefly, is that my high stake or my really high performing kids, they are freaking out when there are timed multiple choice questions.
Oh yeah.
They see the time ticking down, the seconds going down, and they're completely freaking out. And really lowering the value of that and saying, hey, it's a couple of points, you'll be fine. I think really help my students.
My intention was with this, I actually had a few students email me halfway through their part 2. I could see on Canvas their time ticking down. And they said, Dr. Tracey, what do I do? I'm emailing you from my phone. My internet dropped out. And I said, well, you had 2 questions left. Even if you don't answer them, you've done well enough that you don't have to completely panic. So it does help to lower my goal was to really lower the stress of the students there, because especially with the way the spring went, where we were all just baptism by fire of congratulations, you can't go back to campus now. To this, I've been trying to work to keep the students sort of, breathe. I tell them at the start of every exam I've written says, step 1, breathe. If you don't breathe, the exam will be very, very difficult to do.
I was just thinking about the timing of the multiple choice. My daughter's Gen Chem 2 professor this spring, they had timed tests. It was all multiple choice for her course. But what her professor did is that he chose 2 questions in advance. I'm not sure if you knew about them when you were taking the test, but you had so you did the multiple choice, you submitted it, and then you had 10 or 12 hours or whatever it was to write up a brief discussion of how you arrived at your answer. Whether it was right or wrong wasn't really the issue. It was more about how you arrived at your answer and what you got there. And my daughter might chime in, I don't know, she can hear me. And then the quality of your response, I'm sure he had a rubric for it, although I never saw it, or any of her questions, but just how well you defended your answer, or, show it, since it was multiple choice, if it was a math-based problem, you showed the work to get there. If it was more conceptual, explaining your reasoning of why you chose this, and if it was multiple correct, why these were the correct answer or not. So that's a way to sort of earn points back towards the multiple choice. So for a lot of the exams, you got to do that as an extra credit option, and then on the final, it was built into the points. So there are ways to work that approach in, so that if the students are concerned about timing, they can earn something back. It's not all or nothing on the multiple choice, and that might be valuable for those very anxious students or students who don't work well with time pressures.
Kristen, we did something like that too this year. We use UTexas online chemistry, and I would have assign 20 problems from it online, and the kids would basically have a score. Then I would take that same question from the UTexas assignment and put it on a test. This was before remote, and say, okay, here's the answer. Explain how you get it. So I'm asking the question again. So it'd be nice. I guess we could do that in remote. Okay, here's the answer. Explain how you get it,
Right. I think that might be a really good approach to some of the remote assessments. It's something I know I'm struggling with. Write your own questions, write a response, rate it according to the rubric. Here's the answer, explain, here's the question with the answer, explain how.
You get it.
Using
and they've seen the question
more
before.
frequent assessments to get to that might be the way to go. And this flexibility where you're breaking it up, I think is really powerful. And I'm really glad, Matt, that you A, came up with it, and B, were willing to share it with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for listening to my my presentation here. I really appreciate all the feedback and things that have been popping up in the chat. It's been very helpful for not only me to share, but also for everybody to share back. So thank you.
We do have another 10 minutes or so before the session's over. So if there are more questions or discussions, we could also send everyone into breakout rooms and just talk in small groups amongst yourself if you'd like. For the 10 minutes.
But Kristen, it'd be nice to come up with a couple of questions. Like maybe we could have, you see how Matt had that format for the last type of question. It'd be nice if we could maybe share those or come up with questions or in the future, as we cover certain units.
Right, absolutely. We could get a whole conversation going with that, and it could be a persistent kind of support group, definitely. So is there an agreement? Would people like to do breakout rooms and talk for 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna make it happen because I have an hour. I'm just gonna do, let's see, there's 24 of us in the room right now, so I'm gonna do 8 groups, or would you guys, maybe we'll do 6 groups so there's 4 people?
Yeah.
That sounds reasonable.
I think you need at least 4 in order to really have a conversation.
You know what? I'm gonna actually do 5 rooms, so there's 4 or 5 people in the room because I don't. I can jump in. Matt, this is gonna assign you to a room as well, so that'll be great. And I'm just gonna jump into whatever room doesn't have somebody. So they've got like 30 seconds. All right. Well, I don't know how many people actually come back to this, but it was a really great session. No. It was a really great session, and I know in our group we came up with some other ways to approach the idea of the take home, write your own question, assess it, that we found interesting. We did put that in the discussion document, and I can share that link again if people want to add to that, which I'm hoping that you will. No, I'm not talking to you. Sorry, my son's listening in. You can say hi to him in the coffee house because he's been helping out with the conference. That was his job. And so if you had like interesting comments, technically our session is done. It's 12:16. And I do want to make sure everyone can go for lunch, but we can certainly leave this open if people want to continue talking. Jump in and chime in if you have ideas.
I just want to
have
say
one
thank
comment,
you.
Kristen, that has nothing to do with anything.
But it was very useful, and I think a lot of people really related to your idea, Matt. Matt, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. I'm unmuted now.
There you go. So I think that's great, and I think it's time for lunch. Matt, you're welcome to stay for any other sessions this afternoon that you want. We have other things going on, and really, I thank you very much for coming, and I hope everyone's
having me
for the afternoon sessions. So.
Well, enjoy lunch, everyone.
Yes. Bye, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now.
All right.